The great hall doors opened with a loud sound, and cold wind rushed inside, bringing snow and ash with it from the storm outside, and everyone in the room turned to look at who was coming through those big wooden doors that stood at the entrance. She walked in slowly, and her armor looked terrible, like it had been through 100 battles and lost every single one of them. And the metal plates were bent and burned, and one of her shoulder guards hung loose and ready to fall off at any moment, and her gauntlet on the left hand was completely missing, showing scarred skin underneath. The nobles started laughing at her, and Lord Garrett pointed at the stranger and said she looked like a beggar who had picked through old battlefields looking for scraps of metal to wear, and Lady Christine giggled behind her hand, saying that even a child could punch through those broken metal plates. Commander Blake stood up from his chair and put his hand on his sword and told the stranger that this hall was only for real warriors and nobles, and not for people who collected junk from dead soldiers. The stranger did not say anything back to them and just kept walking forward toward the throne, where Queen Helena sat watching everything with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and beside the queen stood Princess Lauren, who was only 16 years old and held a ceremonial spear in her hands. Behind the stranger, something moved in the shadows outside the door, and a low rumbling sound came from there that made some people stop laughing because it sounded dangerous, like thunder before lightning strikes. Queen Helena raised her hand, and everyone became quiet, and she asked the stranger to state her business and tell them why she had come to Silver Peak. The stranger stopped in the center of the hall, right in front of the throne, and stood there for a long moment, not saying anything, and then she reached up with her one good hand and started to unfasten the straps that held her damaged breastplate in place. Lord Garrett laughed again and asked if she planned to give them her broken armor as a gift, because they had no use for scrap metal that could not protect anyone. But then the damaged breastplate fell away and hit the stone floor with a loud clang that echoed through the whole hall, and underneath the broken armor was another layer of armor that looked completely different. This armor underneath glowed like captured starlight, and it was perfect without a single scratch or dent on it, and ancient symbols crawled across its surface, glowing with soft blue light that made everyone stare in wonder. The laughter died immediately, and everyone watched as she removed more pieces of the damaged outer armor, and each piece that fell away revealed more of the perfect armor underneath made from metal that none of them had ever seen before. Lady Catherine, who was the oldest advisor in the kingdom, stood up from her seat with her mouth open and said that the armor was void steel, and she had only seen it in very old tapestries from ancient times. The last piece to come off was the helmet, and when she lifted it away, everyone gasped, because her face was beautiful but also terrible in a way that made people want to look away, and her eyes glowed with gold and red fire mixed together. She said her name was Kira, and she had come because their world was facing complete destruction, and before anyone could ask what she meant, a dragon walked into the hall through the doors. The dragon had to bend down to fit through the entrance, and it was smaller than the huge dragons from stories, but still as big as a war horse, and its scales changed colors between green and blue as it moved, and its eyes showed intelligence and understanding. As it looked at everyone, Kira said the dragon was named Ash, and she was not a pet, but a sister in battle, who had fought beside her through 1,000 battles across 10 different worlds. Princess Lauren found her voice and asked what Kira meant by 10 worlds, because that sounded like madness. Kira looked at the princess with those ancient glowing eyes and said it was not madness, but truth. And the enemy coming toward their kingdom was not just the dark army they had been fighting, but something much worse called the Void Collective, that had already consumed 17 other civilizations. Queen Helena stood up and put her hand on her sword and asked how Kira could possibly know this. Kira said she knew, because she had destroyed the Void's first invasion fleet 300 years ago, and she had been there when they burned her homeworld, and she watched all her people die screaming as the Void consumed them, and she made a promise that day to hunt the Void across every world and every dimension, until either they were dead or she was. The broken armor at her feet turned to ash and drifted away on a wind that should not exist inside the sealed hall, and ash made a soft sound that was both sad and defiant. Commander Blake stepped forward and said, "It was a nice story, but stories did not win wars, and if Kira had real power, she should prove it." Kira raised her hand and reality bent around it and the air twisted, and suddenly there was a window in the center of the hall, but it was not a real window. It was a tear in space itself. Through the tear, everyone could see what lay beyond their protected borders, and there were armies without number stretching to the horizon, and not just regular soldiers, but horrible creatures made of corrupted flesh, and things that lived in shadows. And in the center of it all was a massive tower that pulsed with sick green light. Kira said that was a void spire, and in 3 days it would complete its connection to their world. And when that happened, their whole realm would start to dissolve and merge into the void's domain, and their mountains would scream, and their rivers would run backward, and their dead would rise up to serve the void. The window closed, and several nobles stumbled backward. And Lady Christine pressed her hand to her mouth like she was going to be sick. Kira said she had not come looking for their approval or acceptance, but to offer them a choice to fight with her and maybe survive, or keep mocking her and definitely die. Queen Helena studied Kira for a long time, while everyone around her whispered and argued with fear and pride, fighting in their voices. But the queen kept her eyes locked on those ancient, burning eyes. The queen asked Kira why she continued to fight if this enemy was so powerful, and what drove a woman through 300 years of war. For the first time, something changed in Kira's expression, and it was pain that was old and deep, and she looked at Ash, and the dragon pressed her nose against Kira's shoulder. Kira said someone had to remember, and someone had to carry the stories of all the civilizations that fell, and because every world deserved a chance to fight back. The hall stayed silent, and outside. The storm got louder, as if the approaching darkness could feel the challenge that had just been made. Queen Helena made her decision and drew her sword, and the blade rang as it came out, and she drove it point first into the wooden floor in front of her throne. The queen said they would fight, and told Commander Blake to gather the war council, and told Lady Catherine to send messages to their allies, and told Kira that she would explain everything about the void and how to kill it. Kira nodded slowly with a grim smile and said it would be her honor. But they needed to know that the path ahead would break everything they thought they knew about war, and it would cost them things they could not imagine losing. And in the end, victory might look a lot like defeat. Princess Lauren stepped forward, surprising everyone, and said they would change what victory meant, and asked where they should start. Ash made a sound of approval that vibrated through the stone floor, and Kira put her hand on the dragon's neck. Kira said they would start with the truth about what she was and what Ash was, and why the void feared them above everyone else. As everyone started to reorganize themselves, nobody noticed that the shadows in the corner of the hall were getting darker, or that they seemed to pulse with that same sick green light, because the void was already there, listening to everything. And far away in the mountains, something huge and terrible woke up, sensing the presence of the one who had stopped it so many times before, and the war was about to begin for real. The war council room was deep, inside the mountain where old kings had planned battles against enemies that were now forgotten, and maps covered every surface marked with red ink, showing where the enemy was advancing like blood spreading across paper. Kira stood in the center with Ash coiled beside her, and the dragon's scales reflected light from a dozen lanterns, and around them stood the kingdom's best minds, including Commander Blake with his captains, and Lady Catherine with her scholars, and Queen Helena with Princess Lauren following her everywhere. Kira started by saying they had 3 days before the spire finished connecting to their world. And the real problem was not the spire itself, but what happened after it finished. Queen Helena leaned forward and told Kira to explain what she meant. Kira's eyes flickered with that gold and red glow, and she said, "The void did not conquer worlds just through fighting, but through corruption. And once the spire finished connecting, reality itself would start to fall apart, and their weapons would stop working, and their healing magic would twist and hurt people instead of helping them, and even the ground they stood on would become uncertain." Lord Garrett, who was a general, said that was nonsense, because wars were won with steel and courage, not tricks about reality falling apart. Ash's head turned toward him fast, and her eyes became thin slits, and a low growl came from her throat. Kira put her hand on Ash's neck and told her to be peaceful, and then she turned to Lord Garrett and asked how many soldiers he had lost in the past month. Garrett's jaw got tight, and he said the Dark Army had been attacking hard, and they had lost about 300 men. Kira asked how many of those dead soldiers came back. The room became very cold, and Garrett's face turned pale, and he asked what she meant by that. Kira said in a voice like iron that the void did not just kill people, but it brought them back, and every soldier who died on the battlefield and every person caught in attacks did not stay dead, but the void brought them back, twisted and corrupted and forced to serve it. Lady Catherine stood up with her old hands shaking and said the reports from eastern villages mentioned survivors seeing their dead family members fighting with the enemy, and they thought it was just grief making people see things that were not there. Kira said it was not grief but reality, and those 300 soldiers were now fighting for the enemy. Everyone started shouting and asking questions, and some people reached for weapons, but Queen Helena's voice cut through all the noise and told everyone to be silent. Princess Lauren stepped forward with her young face set hard and asked if they were not just fighting an army but fighting everyone they had ever lost. Then how could they defend against that? Kira looked at her with something like respect and said they could not defend, but had to strike first and strike hard without mercy, because the void fed on hesitation and on emotions, and would use their love and grief and compassion as weapons against them. Commander Blake said quietly that she was asking them to become monsters. Kira said she was asking them to survive, and she had watched 17 civilizations fall to the void, and they all had one thing in common, which was they held on to their ideals even as those ideals destroyed them, and they refused to do what was necessary and died, believing they kept their honor. She walked to the window and looked out at the mountains and said, "Honor meant nothing to the void, and mercy meant nothing. And they would take everything good and twist it into something horrible, and the only question was if they were willing to fight uglier than the void did." Ash stood up and stretched her wings and moved beside Kira. And then something amazing happened because the dragon started to change, and her form blurred and got smaller, and everyone gasped as she transformed into a woman who was tall and thin, with green scales still visible on her neck and arms, and her eyes staying reptilian. Ash said in a voice that had strange harmonics that Kira spoke truth, and they had seen worlds burn and watched heroes become victims of their own goodness. And if they wanted to survive, they had to become something, new Lady Catherine said with wonder, that a dragon who could speak was something she thought only existed. In the oldest legends, Ash said legends were just history that people stopped believing. And she turned to Kira, and there was deep sadness in her eyes, and she said they should show everyone what they were facing. Kira hesitated with old pain crossing her face and asked if Ash was sure. Ash said they needed to see it, and the time for gentle lies was over. Kira nodded and raised both hands, and the air between them shimmered and tore open, making another window. But this time it did not show the present but the past. The vision filled the room and showed a world dying, with cities burning with green fire, and in the streets people ran screaming from shadows that had learned how to hunt and fighting desperately. In the center was a younger Kira with clean armor and eyes that were not yet ancient with sorrow. Beside young Kira fought other warriors in similar armor and dozens of dragons, and they were winning and pushing back the void's forces through pure determination and skill. Then everything changed when a spire burst from the ground in the city's heart, looking exactly like the one now connecting to this world, and as it appeared, reality screamed, and the warriors' weapons broke, and the dragon's fire turned to ash in their throats, and one by one, they started to fall. Young Kira shouted no and begged them not to die, but the dragons died, first corrupted by the void, and their beautiful forms twisted into nightmares, and the warriors fell next with some fighting until their last breath, and others consumed while still alive. And through it all, young Kira kept fighting, even as her world collapsed around her, and even as her friends and family were taken and twisted and turned against her. The vision showed Ash falling when she was a huge dragon, much larger than now, and she was struck down by a corrupted blade, and as she lay dying young, Kira reached her with tears on her face. Ash gasped and told Kira not to let her become one of them. What happened next made several nobles turn away because Kira did what was necessary and gave Ash mercy before the void could claim her. But the story did not end there, because as Ash's body started to fade, something impossible happened, and her essence refused to submit to the void, and instead reached out to Kira and bound itself to her in a way that went beyond death. The vision showed Kira alone in the ruins of her world, holding a small dragon egg that pulsed with green and blue light, which was Ash reborn through their bond and smaller but free from the void. The window closed and the council room was silent, and many faces were wet with tears. Kira said softly that the world was called Valdris, and 42 million elves lived there, with 30,000 dragons and countless other species all in harmony, and the void consumed it all in 8 hours. Princess Lauren asked, in barely a whisper, how Kira survived. Kira said she did not survive, and the woman she was died that day. And what survived was something new, fueled by rage and purpose. And she spent the next 300 years hunting the void across dimensions, and learning how it worked, and becoming the one thing it truly feared. Queen Helena asked what that one thing was. Kira smiled sharp enough to cut, and said someone who refused to die and someone who lost everything, so had nothing left to lose, and someone who killed void lords with bare hands and burned spires to ash with only will and fury. Ash, still in her woman form, put a hand on Kira's shoulder and said they were the Void's nightmare, which was a warrior who could not be corrupted, and a dragon who already died once, and together they destroyed 6 invasion forces. And this would be the 7th. Lord Garrett said slowly, with his doubt finally breaking, that this might be the one that killed them both. Kira said perhaps because the Void grew stronger with each world it ate, but she made a promise on her world's ashes and would see it through with their help, or without it. Queen Helena stood up with her decision made and said Kira had their help and asked what the plan was. Kira moved back to the map and traced lines with her fingers and said the spire was protected by 3 void nexuses, which were corruption wells feeding it power, and they had to destroy those nexuses to make the spire vulnerable. But it would not be easy, because each nexus had a void champion guarding it. Commander Blake asked how strong these champions were. Kira said bluntly that facing one would need their entire silver guard and would probably kill most of them. Blake started to ask how they could possibly do it, but Kira interrupted and said Ash and she would handle the champions while their forces focused on the armies between here and the nexuses, and they had 3 days to travel through enemy land and destroy 3 fortified positions and attack the spire itself, and it was impossible. Lady Catherine asked why they should try. If it was impossible, Kira's ancient eyes looked at all the leaders and said because, in 300 years of fighting, she learned something important, which was the Void expected rational behavior and expected enemies to calculate odds and choose safety, so they would do the opposite and charge straight into death and not stop until they won or fell. Princess Lauren suddenly laughed, not from humor but from how crazy it was, and said, Kira was insane in a brilliant and terrible way. Kira said with a ghost of a smile that she preferred the word experienced and told them what they needed to do. As the council bent over maps planning the impossible, none of them saw that shadows in the corner had grown deeper, and within those shadows something watched with too many eyes, listening to every word and learning every plan. The void was patient and could wait 3 more days because it had already won. Dawn came over Silver Peak with the color of blood, and Kira stood on the high walls with Ash in dragon form beside her, watching 3,000 soldiers gather in the courtyard below, and Queen Helena had sent everyone who could fight. It would not be enough, and it never was. Ash said in a voice only Kira could hear that she was thinking too loud, and her doubt was showing. Kira said it was not doubt, but memory, because she had led armies before and watched them die. Ash asked how this time was different. Ash's reptilian eyes looked at her with old wisdom and said because this time Kira was not fighting alone and had them. Before Kira could answer, Princess Lauren came up the stairs, no longer wearing ceremony clothes, but real armor with a real sword at her side, and her young face showed determination that reminded Kira of warriors lost long ago. Lauren said she was coming with them. Kira said no, flatly. Lauren said it was not Kira's decision. Queen Helena's voice carried across the wall as she came up and said actually it was Kira's decision, because she had given Kira command of all military operations and her word was law until this was over. Lauren spun to face her mother and said she could not be serious because she was trained and capable. Kira interrupted not unkindly and said Lauren was 16 years old and had never killed anyone, and what was coming would break veterans twice her age, and she would not watch another child die. Lauren said she was not a child. Kira said everyone was a child to her, and the weight of centuries in those words made Lauren go quiet, and Kira added that the kingdom needed an heir, and if they failed when they failed, someone had to survive to keep fighting. Queen Helena caught the word and asked when not, if Kira met her eyes steadily, and said she spoke truth, not comforting lies, and the odds of success were about 1 in 30, and the odds of her personal survival were much lower, and she was not leading this army to victory, but to buy time. The Queen's face got hard and asked time for what Kira said for evacuation, and while they attacked the nexuses, the civilians had to flee north to the frozen wastes because the void hated cold, and it slowed corruption, and it would not save everyone, but some might survive to rebuild. Lady Catherine, who had followed, said they were talking about abandoning their homeland that had been theirs for 2,000 years. Kira said the land would be here for 2,000 more and would survive, and the question was if their people would be on it. Commander Blake came next fully armored with his captains and said the army was ready and waiting for Kira to speak to them. Kira looked down at the courtyard, and 3,000 faces looked up at her, young and old, confident and terrified, and they had no idea what they were marching toward. Ash said quietly to tell them the truth because they deserved that much. Kira nodded and jumped over the wall, falling 3 stories, and landing in the courtyard with a crash that cracked the stone, and soldiers were startled but held their ground, and Ash followed, gliding down on spread wings. Kira's voice, carried across the courtyard, made loud by will and magic, and she said she would not lie to them, and what lay ahead was not a battle, but a trip into hell itself, and many would die, and some would beg for death, and even if they won, the cost would be more than they could imagine. People murmured, because this was not the speech they expected. Kira continued with her ancient eyes blazing, and said they had one advantage the Void's armies did not have, which was they knew what they fought for, and every step into darkness they should remember what was behind them, which was their homes and families and world, and the Void fought because it had no choice, but they fought because they chose to. She walked through the ranks with Ash beside her, and soldiers stepped back making a path. Kira said she had fought this enemy for 300 years and seen them destroy civilizations that made theirs look primitive and watched dragons fall and heroes break and entire realities collapse. But she also saw something the Void could never understand, which was ordinary people doing extraordinary things when everything was at stake. She stopped and turned to face everyone and said in 8 hours they would march, and their target was the Eastern Nexus, which was the smallest of three, and they would fight through 12 miles of corrupted land against an enemy that outnumbered them 50-1, and they would lose soldiers at every step, and when they reached the Nexus, they would destroy it, because that was what needed to be done. She raised her hand, and her armor started to glow, casting light across the courtyard like a second sun, and said she was Kira of Valdris and last survivor of a dead world, and she faced the Void's champions and lived, and ash was a dragon reborn from death itself, and burned their armies to ash, and they would lead everyone into darkness and show them how to fight. Ash reared up, spreading her wings wide, and released a roar that shook the mountain, and green fire came from her jaws, lighting up the dawn sky. Kira's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow everyone heard clearly, and she asked who would march with them and who would show the Void this world was not theirs to take. Silence stretched for a heartbeat, then another. Then Commander Blake stepped forward, drawing his sword and raising it high, and shouted. The Silver Guard stood with Kira. His captains did the same. Then regular soldiers, then mages, and within moments, 3,000 blades pointed at the sky, and 3,000 voices roared defiance. Kira allowed herself a small smile, because courage at least they had plenty of, and whether that would be enough remained to be seen. The march started at midday, with Kira and Ash leading, and Commander Blake's Silver Guard forming the center, and Lady Catherine stayed behind to organize civilian evacuation. Princess Lauren also stayed, though she did so with barely hidden anger, and Kira suspected she would find a way to follow, because young ones always did. They moved in silence like a steel snake through mountain passes, and weather got colder as they went down from Silver Peak's heights, and first signs of corruption appeared after 3 hours. Trees had bark that wept black liquid, and grass grew in spiral patterns that defied nature, and in the distance, shapes moved wrong as if reality disagreed with their existence. A scout appeared from the tree line and reported Void soldiers, about 200, moving to stop them. Commander Blake asked about numbers. The scout said mixed force with corrupted humans and elves who moved like former soldiers, and 3 shadow stalkers. Kira's face darkened because shadow stalkers were Void champions of the lowest level, but still dangerous, and each could tear through a dozen soldiers before falling. Kira decided she and Ash would handle the stalkers, and told Commander Blake his Silver Guard should take the center and regular forces provide support, and reminded them not to look at corrupted faces because they were not friends anymore. A young soldier asked with a trembling voice, "What if they recognize them?" Kira turned to her with ancient eyes holding only honesty and said, "Then kill them anyway, or they would kill you. And tomorrow, you would be the one someone else had to kill, and there was no middle ground in this war." The soldier swallowed hard but nodded. The Void forces attacked at the bottom of the pass coming from corrupted forest with inhuman speed, and former soldiers moved in coordinated patterns with tactics still recognizable, even though their bodies became something else with black veins under translucent skin and eyes glowing sick green, and where they stepped ground withered. Commander Blake's Silver Guard met them with disciplined precision, and enchanted blades cut through corrupted flesh. But for every enemy that fell, 2 more appeared from darkness. Shadowstalkers came next as creatures of living void, shapeless, except when they struck, and they flowed across the battlefield like oil, with forms constantly shifting between solid and not solid. Kira met the first one head-on, and her blade passed through its form twice, seemingly doing nothing. Then on the 3rd strike, she whispered words in a language older than elven civilization, and her sword started burning with blue-white fire. This time, when the blade connected, the stalker screamed like reality tearing, and it shook with its form, becoming solid just long enough for Kira to drive her sword through what might be its heart. Ash grabbed the second stalker in her jaws, with dragonfire burning from inside, and the creature twisted trying to phase through her, but Ash's flames were not normal fire, but dragon essence, which was poison to void corruption. The third stalker was more clever and bypassed the main battle, flowing toward the rear guard, where younger soldiers stood. Kira shouted a warning, but it was too late. The stalker appeared with form, becoming something with too many arms and not enough mercy, and struck down 3 soldiers before anyone reacted with each touch, leaving spreading corruption on their skin. Then Princess Lauren was there. She had followed the army after all, staying hidden in the rear guard, and now stood between the stalker and more victims, with her ceremonial spear, no longer ceremonial, glowing. With quickly activated magic, Commander Blake shouted for her to get back and tried to reach her. But Lauren did not retreat, and as the stalker attacked, she did something unexpected by dropping her defensive stance and charging forward, driving her spear right into the creature's mass. The magic activated and light exploded from the weapon, burning through shadow and void, and the stalker pulled back, wounded but not dead, and prepared for a killing strike. It never landed. Kira appeared in a blur, taking the stalker's head, or what looked like it, clean off, and the creature disappeared with its essence scattering to wind. Kira said quietly, not looking at Lauren, that she disobeyed orders. Lauren replied with voice shaking, but defiant, that she saved lives. Kira said this time, then finally turned to face her and said next time she might die, or worse, be corrupted, and Kira would have to kill her, and could she live with that? And could her mother Lauren's defiance cracked a little, and she said she could not sit in the castle while others fought? Kira studied her for a long moment, seeing echoes of past warriors in her young face, and finally sighed and told Commander Blake that Princess Lauren was now under his direct supervision, and if she did anything stupid to sit on her, Blake said with pleasure, though there was approval in his eyes because the princess proved herself at least a little. The rest of the Void Force fell quickly once stalkers were gone, but the cost was clear, with 17 soldiers dead and another 8 wounded with corruption spreading through their blood. Kira approached the corrupted wounded lying on ground, with black veins spreading across skin and eyes starting to glow green. She said simply, there was no cure, not here. Not now, and they had 2 choices: to die clean or let corruption take them and become the enemy. The wounded soldiers understood, and one by one made their choice, and most chose death, and 2 chose to stay behind, to take as many Void soldiers with them as possible when corruption finished. It was brutal and practical and necessary, and it tore at something in Kira she thought long dead, which was her humanity. As they prepared to move on, Ash nuzzled against her in dragon form and said quietly that Kira did what had to be done. Kira said she knew, and that was what made it worse. They marched on, leaving the dead behind, moving deeper into corrupted land, and the Eastern Nexus lay 6 hours ahead, and with it their first true test. The Void was waiting. Night fell like a dark cloth over corrupted forest, and Kira's army made camp 3 miles from Eastern Nexus, close enough to see sick green glow pulsing against clouds, but far enough to avoid immediate detection. Around campfires, soldiers spoke in hushed voices, cleaning weapons and checking armor, and many wrote letters they hoped would never need delivering, because the battle at the pass showed them reality, that this was no glorious campaign, but survival measured in blood and bodies. Kira stood apart from camp, studying the Nexus through a far-seeing glass taken from the enemy, and the structure was hard to describe, like a tower existing in multiple dimensions at once, with walls shifting between solid stone and transparent void stuff, and around its base, corruption spread like disease, turning land into something alien and hostile. Commander Blake joined her on the overlook and asked about defenses. Kira said 3 rings with outer ring, being standard corrupted soldiers maybe 1,000 strong, and middle ring being elite void, warriors, faster, stronger, harder to kill. maybe 200. And inner ring was where it got interesting. Blake asked if interesting meant deadly. Kira said interesting meant they would need everything they had and quite a bit of luck. Ash approached in her woman form with scales gleaming in moonlight and said the Void Champion was awake and she could feel its presence from here. Blake asked hopefully if there was just one. Kira said one was enough because Nexus Guardians were second-level Void Champions and they were to Shadow Stalkers what dragons were to house cats. Blake asked if she could beat it. Kira was quiet for a moment, then said she killed 3 Nexus Guardians before, but lost 17 dragons and 42 warriors doing it, and here it would just be Ash. And her Blake said those were terrible odds. Kira said welcome to her life for the past 3 centuries. Princess Lauren climbed the overlook having successfully avoided her guards again, and she proved surprisingly good at that. Over the past 6 hours, Lauren announced without introduction that she had been thinking, and Kira was planning to attack through the front to draw attention while Ash flew over to destroy the Nexus itself. Kira glanced at her with mild surprise and said that was actually quite close and asked how she figured it out. Lauren said because it was the stupidest possible plan, and Kira seemed to specialize in stupid plans. Despite herself, Kira laughed a little. Lauren said she could offer an alternative and unrolled a map on ground explaining the Nexus was built on top of old trade road, which used to have maintenance tunnels for water drainage, and they should run right under the Nexus site. Blake emphasized the word. Lauren explained the tunnels were sealed 40 years ago when they changed trade routes, but should still exist. And if they could access them, Kira studied the map with new interest and said they could bypass outer defenses entirely and come up inside inner ring. Ash said it was still suicide, but faster. Suicide, and she approved. Lauren said hesitantly. There was one problem, which was the tunnel entrance was in village of Brookside, which fell to void 3 weeks ago, and getting in meant fighting through corrupted land, while the main force held the Nexus defenders' attention. Kira thought about a small strike team that was fast, quiet, and expendable. Lauren offered immediately to lead it. Kira said absolutely not. Lauren said they needed someone who knew the tunnel system, and she explored them as a child. Because it was her secret playground before they sealed them, Kira opened her mouth to refuse, then stopped because Lauren was right, and having a guide could mean difference between success and getting lost in dark. While Void closed in, Kira decided Commander Blake would lead the main assault with 2,000 soldiers to make enough noise that Void thought that was the real attack, and Princess Lauren would take a strike team with her 10 best soldiers through tunnels, and Ash and she would fight the Nexus Guardian to keep it busy. Blake asked, "What if the tunnels were collapsed?" Kira said, "Then they would do the stupid plan, but at least they tried clever stupidity." First, dawn came too quickly, and army assembled in silence before battle. With each soldier understanding many would not see another sunrise, and Commander Blake walked among ranks offering quiet encouragement while captains checked equipment and formations. Kira gathered the strike team near camp's edge, and Lauren had chosen her soldiers well, all veterans, all young enough to move quickly through tight spaces, all completely loyal to their princess. Kira told them bluntly they were about to see things that would haunt them forever, because Brookside was home to 300 people, and they were all still there in a way, and would recognize them and call out their names and beg for help, but they could not stop or hesitate. 10 heads nodded, though several faces went pale. Kira said to stay close to the princess because she knew the path and she would clear way to tunnel entrance. Then they were on their own, and the Nexus had to fall within 2 hours or corruption would spread too far to stop, and told them to move fast. Trust each other, and if someone fell. One veteran finished grimly saying they keep moving and they knew the drill. Kira nodded approval and said to go. Remind the Void why they feared them. The approach to Brookside was like going into nightmare, with forest itself becoming hostile and trees bent toward them with grabbing branches, and grass moved like snakes, and always there were whispers, because Void knew they were coming and welcomed them with promises of nothing. They reached Brookside at dawn's end, and village appeared normal at first, with buildings still standing and streets still recognizable, but as they got closer, corruption showed itself. Villagers walked through their daily routines as if nothing changed, with a baker making bread from corrupted flesh, and blacksmith hammering metal that screamed, and children playing games with rules that made no sense. And when they saw approaching soldiers, they smiled. A woman called out with voice almost normal, except for strange vibrations saying welcome home, and they had been waiting and to stay with them forever. The strike team kept moving with weapons ready, but corrupted villagers did not attack and just watched with green, glowing eyes, tracking every movement. Lauren whispered, pointing to a stone structure at village center that the well house was there, and tunnel entrance was underneath. Kira led the way with her armor glowing with protective magic, and as they got close to well house, corrupted villagers finally moved, but not to attack, as they formed a wall blocking the path. A young girl stepped forward and said, "Please don't go," and one soldier gasped, because it was his daughter lost in the village's fall, and she asked if Daddy wanted to stay with her. The soldier's weapon shook, and Kira moved instantly, putting herself between father and corrupted child. Kira said quietly that she was gone, and what they saw was a puppet wearing her face. The soldier started to speak, but Kira said she knew it hurt and knew he wanted to believe, but the kindest thing he could do for her memory was keep moving. With tears on his face, the soldier nodded and looked away, and strike team pushed forward, and Kira made the choice soldiers throughout history had to make, which was killing the corrupted to save the living. Her blade moved with surgical precision, dropping corrupted villagers before they could trigger whatever trap Void prepared, and it was brutal and efficient and completely without mercy. Kira shouted for them to go, and she would hold them there. Lauren and her team ran for well house, and behind them, more corrupted villagers came from buildings, dozens of them, hundreds, all moving toward Kira's position. Ash landed beside her with wings spreading wide and said always the dramatic last stand with Kira. Kira asked would she have it any other way. Ash laughed like cracking stone and said, "Never. Together." They held the well house while strike team went into darkness with dragon fire washing over corrupted flesh and void steel, cutting through animated bodies, and through it all, Kira fought with cold precision of someone who did this far too many times. Below ground, Lauren's team moved through tunnels smelling of age and rot, and Princess led with confidence, with childhood memories, guiding them through crossroads that all looked the same. Lauren stopped at a collapsed section and said this used to lead under the trade road, and they needed to dig through soldiers-attacked rubble with digging tools working quickly, despite oppressive darkness. And behind them something shuffled in tunnels because Void found them. Lauren ordered them to keep digging and drew her spear facing darkness, with remaining soldiers forming a line beside her. What came out was worse than corrupted villagers, because these were void-born creatures created entirely by Nexus, never having been human or elf, and they crawled on too many legs, with forms constantly shifting and mouths opening where mouths should never be. Lauren's spear flashed forward, taking first creature through its center, and it screamed and dissolved, but 3 more took its place, and her soldiers fought desperately with training. Barely good enough against enemies that had no normal body parts. One digger shouted breakthrough. Lauren commanded them to go and get to Nexus, and she would hold them. A soldier started to protest, but Lauren said that was an order. Soldiers hesitated only a moment before obeying and scrambled through newly opened passage, and Lauren stood alone in tunnel with spear, moving like silver blur in darkness, holding back nightmares while her team finished their mission. She lasted 47 seconds before being overwhelmed with a void, Born's claw cutting across her ribs, spreading corruption, and another grabbed her ankle, pulling her down, and she fought until spear was torn away, until her arms were pinned, until green light started spreading across her skin. Then something impossible happened. The corruption stopped. Lauren's royal blood carried traces of Ancient magic, which were protective spells placed by kingdoms' founders thousands of years ago, and it was not enough to stop corruption completely, but it slowed it and bought precious minutes. Minutes she used to crawl after her soldiers, dragging herself through tunnel, even as Voidborn swarmed behind her, moving toward final fight. Above ground, Kira and Ash heard explosion as Strike Team destroyed Nexus's main power source, and structure shook with green glow flickering. Ash said with surprise in voice that they did it, but Kira's face stayed grim and said the Guardian was coming out, and now it got ugly. Nexus split open, and from inside came something that hurt to look at directly, which was a Void Champion in true form, wearing reality like uncomfortable clothing, and it was sort of human-shaped if humans were twice as tall, and made of compressed darkness with evil intent. It spoke with voice that made frequencies shatter nearby stones and said, "Kira of Valdris," and they had been expecting her. Kira raised her blade and said if they expected her, they should have run. Guardian laughed and said she destroyed Nexuses before, but always when newly formed and vulnerable, and this one fed for 3 weeks and was stronger than anything she faced. Kira said coldly, that was good, because she worried this would be boring. What followed was a battle. Survivors would struggle to describe later because Kira and Guardian moved faster than normal eyes could follow, with their fighting sending shockwaves that flattened corrupted trees, and Ash circled above shooting dragonfire whenever she saw an opening, but Guardian ignored her attacks like annoying rain. Guardian taunted, saying Kira was aging, and 3 centuries of war were taking their toll, and asking how much longer she could keep fighting. Kira did not answer with words, but instead did something she swore never to do again, which was open herself to Void just slightly, just enough to touch its power without being eaten by it. Her armor blazed with black and blue fire, and eyes burned with power that made Guardian hesitate. Kira's voice came out with multiple harmonics, asking if Guardian wanted to see how long she could keep fighting, and said, "Let me show you." Next exchange happened too fast for watchers to understand, and Kira's blade found gaps in Guardian's defense that should not exist, and each strike carved away pieces of creature's essence, and all the while she spoke in that ancient language with words older than creation, binding Guardian and weakening it and preparing it for the killing. Blow Guardian gasped with form, becoming unstable, saying impossible, and no mortal should be able to. Kira drove her blade through where Guardian's heart would be if void creatures had hearts, and said she stopped being mortal 300 years ago and was something much worse now. Guardian exploded with essence, scattering to winds, and Nexus, already damaged by Strike Team's work, collapsed completely, with structure folding into itself until nothing remained but burned earth. But the cost was visible as Kira dropped to one knee with armor cracked and black void energy bleeding from wounds she did not remember getting, and power she touched was poison, killing her from within. Ash landed beside her, shifting to woman form, and said she was a fool because she promised never to use that power again. Kira managed through teeth pressed together to say she had to, because she needed to end it quickly, and asked about Lauren's team. A weak voice called out, saying, "Here." Strike Team came out from collapsed Nexus carrying their princess, and Lauren's armor was torn with corruption spreading across skin. But she was alive and aware, Lauren said, managing a pained smile, that they did it and one Nexus down. Kira looked at her then, at army gathering in distance, then at ruins of Nexus, and thought 1 down and 2 to go, and each would be stronger than last. Kira said quietly to Ash that she needed her to burn away corruption, all of it. Ash said that would kill her. Kira said it would hurt terribly, but she would survive because she always did. Ash hesitated but finally nodded, and dragonfire controlled and precise washed over Kira's wounds, burning away Void's poison, and Kira screamed with sound echoing across battlefield. But when it finished, her wounds were clean. Commander Blake arrived with medical supplies and a report saying 270 soldiers dead and another 100 wounded, and casualties were growing. Blake asked bluntly if they could do this 2 more times. Kira looked at sky where dark clouds gathered, because Void knew their plan now and next. Nexus would be ready, and the one after would be a death trap. Kira said they had to, because if they did not, their kingdom died, and their world died, and Void added another place to its collection. She turned to face her beaten army with voice carrying across field, saying 1 Nexus down and 2 to go and Void. Thought they would break at first challenge, and they were wrong, and tomorrow they strike Northern Nexus and told them to rest tonight and mourn fallen and prepare, because worst was yet to come. A ragged cheer went up mixed with exhaustion and grief, but unbroken. As night fell, medics worked to save Princess Lauren, fighting corruption spreading through her blood, and Kira sat beside her watching battle between ancient magic and void poison. Commander Blake asked if she would live. Kira admitted she did not know because Lauren's bloodline gave her a chance, but corruption this deep she had seen go either way. Blake asked, what if she did not live? Kira's ancient eyes reflected firelight and said, then she would have died like a warrior, not a princess. And it was more than most got Lauren stirred with eyes opening and corruption stopped spreading, held back by her royal blood's protection. But it had not gone away, Lauren whispered, asking Kira to tell her mother she was sorry she could not stay safe like she wanted. Kira said to tell her herself, because she was not dying today. Lauren asked how she could be sure. For first time in entire campaign, Kira smiled a genuine expression, touched with something that might be hope, Kira said, because she fought this war for 300 years and learned to recognize survivors when she saw them, and Lauren was too stubborn to die from a little corruption. Lauren laughed weakly, then winced at pain it caused, and said a little corruption, and Kira had a gift for understatement. Kira said to rest because tomorrow they marched again, and she suspected they would need every fighter they had. As Lauren drifted into healing sleep, Kira looked at northern horizon, where second Nexus pulsed with power, because Void was waiting, and this time it would be ready for them. But so would she. Northern Nexus stood on ruins of what had been High Monastery, a place where elven monks studied reality's nature for thousands of years, and now it was corruption made real, a twisted spire reaching toward sky like a claw trying to tear through heaven itself. Kira's army, now reduced to 1,900 souls, approached through snowstorm that should not exist in this season, because Void was changing local weather patterns and rewriting natural law, and soon would begin rewriting more basic things. Commander Blake muttered that he could not feel his fingers with breath-making mist in unnatural cold. Ash replied in her woman form that he should be grateful. That was all he could not feel, because Void was showing new defenses and temperature control was just the beginning, and frost gathered on her scales. Though she seemed unbothered, Princess Lauren rode in supply wagon too weak to march, but insisting on coming with army despite her mother's angry protests sent via urgent messenger, and corruption had been stabilized, held in check by royal blood magic and daily treatments from army's healers. But she would never be quite the same, with black veins making patterns across neck and arms as permanent reminders of how close she came to complete change. Kira walked at front, with her armor dulled by frost and exhaustion, because 3 days of forced marches through corrupted land took their toll, and soldiers moved like machines driven by will rather than strength. A scout appeared from snow and reported void forces in significant numbers ahead, and they were not trying to hide but waiting in formation. Kira exchanged looks with Ash and said a formal battle was new. Ash agreed, saying Void was adapting and learning their tactics, and this would not be like Eastern Nexus. They reached a ridge and saw what waited for them, because Void forces formed proper military ranks with 5,000 corrupted soldiers organized into companies with clear command structures, and behind them Void-born creatures served as shock troops, and watching everything standing before Nexus itself were 3 Void champions. Not 1, but 3 commander. Blake said flatly. They could not win this in a straight fight because they were outnumbered and outmatched. Kira studied Battlefield with eyes that witnessed 1,000 similar situations, and her mind ran through scenarios calculating odds and weighing lives against goals. She said finally that he was right, and they could not win conventionally. Blake asked what they did. Then Kira turned to face her army with 1,900 exhausted soldiers, most bearing wounds from previous fights, all waiting for her to work another miracle. She announced they would cheat because Void expected them to charge their position, and they would give them exactly what they expected, but make them regret it. She gathered her officers, including Commander Blake and his remaining captains, and Lady Catherine's chief mage, who insisted on joining campaign, and Princess Lauren, who dragged herself from wagon. Despite protests, Kira began saying Northern Nexus was most heavily defended, but had a weakness because it was built on High Monastery's ruins, which meant it was built on top of a place where multiple energy lines met and reality was naturally thin. Blake admitted he was not following. Kira explained Void used corrupted reality to anchor its nexuses, but here reality was already weak before they arrived, and if they could break Nexus's connection to the energy lines, structure would collapse from within. Lauren leaned forward, ignoring pain the movement caused, and said the monastery's central chamber because monks built it directly over the meeting point, and if it still existed under Nexus, Kira confirmed. Then they had a target. But reaching it meant fighting through 5,000 corrupted soldiers and 3 Void champions. The chief mage muttered impossible odds again. Kira replied with grim smile, saying it was her specialty, and explained the plan with Commander Blake leading main force in frontal assault to make it look desperate, like they were throwing everything at them. Blake said they were throwing everything at them. Kira said yes, but they needed Void to think they were stupid about it and to draw forces out and commit their champions to battle, and once they were engaged, Ash and she would take a secondary team of 50 soldiers no more and circle around to Nexus's rear and infiltrate ruins and reach Central Chamber and destroy the anchor. Blake asked about Void champions. Kira's face darkened and said she would handle them one way or another. The plan was madness, barely a step above suicide, but it was a chance which was more than they had in days. Battle began at dawn, though sun was barely visible through Void-darkened sky, and Commander Blake led 2,000 soldiers in a charge against Void's defensive positions. Corrupted forces met them with disciplined violence because these were not mindless zombies, but converted soldiers who kept their tactical training, and they formed shield walls and did flanking moves and adapted to Elven armies' strategies with terrifying efficiency. Blake fought at center of formation with sword, rising and falling with mechanical precision, and around him soldiers died, but they died buying time for Kira's desperate plan. 3 Void champions entered battle after first hour, and each was a nightmare given form, with first one wielding a blade that cut through space itself, and second could become not solid at will, and third simply sent out an effect that caused nearby soldiers to feel terrible fear. Blake faced third champion personally, though every instinct screamed at him to run, and his enhanced armor enchanted by army's remaining mages helped resist fear effect, but it was like trying to fight while drowning. Champion said with voice like grinding stones that their leader abandoned them and Kira already failed, and they died for nothing. Blake snarled, saying then he would die on his feet, and lunged forward. Kira's secondary team moved. Through corrupted land, circling battlefield, and Ash in full dragon form now carried them across ravines and over defensive positions. Void had not bothered to heavily guard because they never expected a flanking force this deep into corruption territory. Princess Lauren insisted on joining this team despite weakened state, and Kira eventually agreed because her knowledge of Monastery's layout was invaluable. They reached Nexus's rear entrance, which was a gaping wound in reality leaking green light and distorting space, and Kira studied it with professional wariness. One soldier asked if it was trapped. Kira confirmed absolutely because Void would never leave such obvious entry unguarded, but they were not using the entrance. She raised her hands, and her armor began to glow with power she touched during Eastern Nexus battle, which was Void energy. She swore not to use surging through her again, and this time, instead of fighting corruption, she shaped it and controlled it, and used it as a key. A new entrance tore open in Nexus's side, bypassing all traps. Void prepared. Lauren breathed, asking how Kira replied, with eyes glowing that dangerous black and blue fire that she knew how they thought. Because she fought them so long, she started to understand them, and maybe too well. Ash pressed her nose against shoulder in gesture of concern, saying Kira was taking in too much corruption, and her soul would not survive another battle like this. Kira replied quietly that it did not matter, because after this, there was only one Nexus left, which was Central Spire, and one more fight, and she just needed to last that long. They entered Nexus, descending into a place that was hard to describe, with interior larger than exterior suggested and twisted hallways leading in directions that should not exist, and gravity worked sideways, and time flowed inconsistently where they would take one step. And suddenly it was hours later. Lauren guided them as best she could using childhood memories of Monastery's layout, but Void transformed everything with sacred meditation chambers, now being pits filled with screaming darkness, and libraries that preserved ancient wisdom now being displays of corrupted flesh arranged in mockeries of art. Lauren said, pointing to a stairwell going down into absolute darkness, that central chamber was below 3 levels down. If Void had not restructured everything, they had not made it halfway down when attack came, with Void-born creatures coming from walls themselves, dozens of them with forms constantly shifting between solid and not solid. Kira's team fought desperately in narrow stairwell with enchanted weapons, barely good enough against enemies that could phase through armor, and soldiers fell consumed by corruption or torn apart by creatures that should not exist. Kira commanded, drawing her blade to go and get to chamber, and she would hold them. Lauren protested, saying she could not fight them all. Kira said she did not need to fight them all, just needed to last long enough for them to destroy Anchor. Ash stayed at her side with dragonfire filling stairwell with burning heat, and together they became a wall of death, refusing to let Void-born pass. Lauren led remaining soldiers, now down to 30, further into depths, racing against time and corruption, and they reached Central Chamber to find it transformed into something horrible with energy lines, once invisible flows of natural magic now visible as pulsing veins of corruption feeding Nexus above. A soldier asked how they destroyed it. Lauren approached center of chamber where ancient monks once meditated on reality's nature, and now a pulsing mass of void energy occupied space like an anchor driven deep into world's foundation. She said, with this drawing her spear, the same weapon she used against Shadowstalker weeks ago, with its magic renewed and strengthened and prepared for this exact purpose. She drove it into Anchor. Reality screamed, energy lines shook, rejecting corruption forced into them, and chamber began to collapse, not physically, but dimensionally, with space folding in on itself, as Nexus lost its grip on reality. Lauren shouted to run above on battlefield. Commander Blake felt the change with Void champions stumbling as their connection to Nexus, disrupted and corrupted forces wavered with coordination. Failing, Blake roared to press the advantage because they were weakening. Elven army surged forward with renewed desperation, driving into confused Void forces, and battle turned slowly and at terrible cost. But it turned. Kira felt it too, with Nexus dying and her plan succeeding, but success came with a price. Void-born, creatures sensing their anchor's destruction went berserk and swarmed Kira and Ash in waves that seemed endless, with each wave more desperate than last. Ash gasped with dragonfire dimming from exhaustion, saying they needed to retreat. Kira replied, "Not yet, because others needed more time to escape." Ash said she would die here. Kira's smile was sad and ancient, saying she died before and was good at it. She opened herself further to Void's corruption, drawing power that burned her soul, even as it filled her body with strength, and armor blazed with black fire, and blade moved faster than thought, cutting down Void born by dozens. But cost was visible, with black veins spreading across skin, matching those on Princess Lauren's. Because Void was claiming her slowly but surely, Ash saw it happening and said no. She would not lose her again. Not like this. She transformed, expanding into her full dragon form, which was the form she barely used since resurrection, saving it for only most terrible moments, and she filled Stairwell entirely with body-creating wall between Kira and Void-born Ash, commanded with voice full of dragon power to get out, and she would hold them because Kira carried them for 300 years and let her carry Kira this once. Kira said her name, but Ash shouted, "Go!" Kira hesitated only a moment, then ran, sprinting. Upstairs, as Ash released dragon fire so intense it melted stone, and behind her she heard Ash's roar of defiance, and heard Void-born shrieking, and heard the battle that would be her last. She came out from Nexus to find Lauren and survivors already outside, with structure collapsing behind them, and battlefield had turned with Void forces retreating, and champions recalled to defend their dying Nexus. Lauren asked where Ash was. Kira could not answer and simply watched as Nexus folded in on itself, taking everything inside, including her oldest friend and sister in battle and companion, through 3 centuries of hell into nothing. Northern Nexus fell, leaving nothing but burned earth and memories. That night Army made camp in silence because they won technically with 2 Nexuses down, and only Central Spire remaining, but cost had been terrible. Of 3,000 soldiers who marched from Silver Peak, fewer than 700 remained able to fight, and Commander Blake had been wounded by Void Champion with left arm corrupted beyond healing, and Princess Lauren's corruption spread further during battle with royal blood barely keeping her alive. And Kira sat alone on a ridge overlooking Army, staring at spot where Nexus had been, where Ash made her last stand. Lady Catherine said, joining her, that Ash knew what would happen and knew Kira would try to stop her, and that was why she did not give a choice. Kira said quietly that 300 years they fought together, and she lost friends and lost comrades and lost entire armies. But Ash was the last piece of her old life, and last reminder that she used to be something other than this weapon against Void. Catherine asked what she was now. Kira looked at her hands, at black veins spreading across them, mirror images of Lauren's corruption, and said something that fought so long it did not remember peace, and something that touched Void. So many times it was becoming hard to tell apart from what it fought. Catherine asked if she would survive final battle. Kira admitted probably not, because Central Spire was strongest Nexus, and she burned through every reserve she had, and corruption she took in was too much to burn away this time, and when they attacked Spire, she would probably be consumed and become just another Void champion for some other hero to fight centuries from now. Catherine asked, then why continue? Kira pointed to camp below at 700 soldiers who still believed and still fought and still hoped, and said, because they needed to see this through, and because their world deserved a chance, and because Ash believed she could do this and died believing it, and she owed it to her to finish what they started. Lady Catherine was quiet for a long moment, then said, evacuation was nearly complete, with Queen Helena moving civilians into frozen wastes, and if Kira failed, some would survive to rebuild. Kira asked what if they succeeded. Catherine said, then she would have saved a world again for what it was worth. Kira stood looking toward south, where Central Spire pulsed with evil power, and thought one more battle and one more impossible victory, then she could rest. She ordered to gather troops, and said tomorrow they marched on Spire, and to tell them this was last fight, and tell them to hold nothing back, and tell them that 300 years ago a world died while she watched helplessly, and tomorrow they make sure that did not happen again. As Lady Catherine left, Kira felt something in her pocket which was a small-scale emerald green that Ash gave her decades ago. She promised the empty air, saying she would finish this for Ash and for all of them, and for every world Void took and every world it wanted to take, and one last battle, then she was done. The scale glowed softly in her hand, as if answering far to South Central Spire, felt her approach and prepared its defenses. Because Void knew Kira of Valdris was coming, and knew she lost her dragon companion, and knew she was weakened and corrupted. But Void learned one thing in 3 centuries of hunting her, which was Kira was always most dangerous when she had nothing left to lose. Final battle was coming, and the world held its breath.